Should I begin? Okay, we're ready and we're so excited. Good morning, everyone. I am Heidi Shepard, Board President of the North Urban Human Services Alliance, or NUHSA. And we're welcoming you today to NUHSA's Affordable Housing Week Lunch and Learn with our very own Gregg Colburn, co-author of Homelessness is a Housing Problem. NUHSA is a growing membership organization of human services providers, city staff and electeds, faith leaders, and community advocates, all united in increasing services and access to them in the communities of North King County. Our work fosters partnerships between our members to enhance available services, increases the awareness of new and established services in North King County, as well as developing trainings based on the interests and needs of our members. Today's Lunch and Learn is a result of their requests. In this time of unprecedented turmoil, we begin every day with a focus on meeting the basic needs of our communities, such as housing, such as food, by creatively working together. And we're also focusing on supporting each other, especially those providing services client to client. We invite you to join NUHSA and be part of this incredible collaboration of people throughout North King County. We love new members, and we're a very, very energetic and compassionate group. Today's goal, however, is to provide you with accurate, current information about the forces that increase the number of individuals and families facing homelessness in our area and throughout King County every single day. We hope that you will share this information with your colleagues, your friends, your families, and your enemies. Share the information, share the accurate information so that we can all work together. Most of all, we want to thank you. And I'm looking here because we have 175 people registered this morning. That's an incredible response to an incredible topic. We thank you for joining us today. Now I'd like to introduce Jesse Simpson from downtown, from the Housing Development Consortium, to share a few words. Jesse?
Yeah, thanks for that. And thank you all for attending this Affordable Housing Week event. Just want to highlight that there's a number of events throughout this entire week. I'll post a link in the chat after this with more events to attend. I'm the Director of Government Relations and Policy here at the Housing Development Consortium, and we work on behalf of our members who cover the gamut, over 200 organizations working on affordable housing, developing it, building it, funding it, and we work to advance our advocacy agenda, which is centered on increasing funding for affordable housing, removing barriers to the construction of new housing of all types, and ensuring that housing is healthy, stable, and safe for the low-income residents that we serve. Really excited to see Gregg Colburn's presentation. I think he does an excellent job of laying out the structural factors that lead to homelessness and tying together the issues of homelessness and housing affordability, which I think are often misunderstood in popular discourse. So that want to thank you again all for attending this. Hope you get a lot out of it, and I'll post a link to all of the future Affordable Housing Week events in the chat. Thanks. And now, yeah, move it over to Gregg Colburn, the honored speaker for today.
Okay.
Or is it Juliana?
It's me. Juliana.
It's me. I'm Juliana Pui. I am the NUHSA Housing and Homelessness Chair, and it's my honor to jump in and give Gregg Colburn a quick introduction. Gregg, in case you don't know, he's a local research hero. He is an associate professor at the University of Washington. He publishes research on topics related to housing and homelessness. Is the co-author of the book Homelessness is a Housing Problem: How Structural Factors Explain U.S. Patterns. His research has been featured in leading media outlets including The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Economist, Bloomberg, and NPR. Gregg holds an MBA from Northwestern University, an MSW and PhD from the University of Minnesota. And prior to academia, he worked as an investment banker and private equity professional. At the University of Washington, Gregg teaches classes in housing, urban economics, and finance. He also, in his spare time, serves as the co-chair as the University of Washington's Homelessness Research Institute and is a member of the National Alliance to End Homelessness Research Council. I know we're all very excited to hear from Gregg throughout his presentation. You might have some questions, you might have some comments. We will have time for some Q&A. It will be at the very end. We will not be interrupting his presentation. So if you have questions, please enter those into the chat. So please type those up into the Zoom Q&A or be prepared to raise your hand via the Zoom function at the very last 10-15 minutes of the presentation. And now we give the time to Gregg. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Juliana. I really appreciate the introduction. Are you hearing me okay? Great. And thanks to NUHSA, Heidi, Sarah, et cetera. Thanks to Jesse and HDC for all their work throughout the year, but particularly at this time, raising awareness for issues related to affordable housing in our communities. And I also see a number of familiar faces, or at least black boxes on the screen. I've got a couple of former students in the Zoom room, which is awesome, and then former research colleagues at both the city and the county, which is fantastic. And so I really take our relationships with the public sector very seriously, and they're super important colleagues for us as we think about some of these shared challenges that we face. So I'm gonna run through my presentation here and attempt to share my screen. How's that? Good. Some of you may have heard this, so you can do the Wordle or whatever you want to do in over the next 35 minutes. Jesse, I'm looking at you. You've definitely heard this a few times. So for those of you who don't know me, I got to the University of Washington in 2017. I'm actually coming to you from my new office, which is not yet decorated. I know it looks like I'm in a hostage situation or something, but I'm not. I'm here just at UW. And money's a little tight right now, as you may imagine. So I got here in 2017 and got to meet a number of you relatively quickly after moving here, because I study housing and homelessness. And my observation in attending these meetings was that we had a shared understanding in Seattle and King County and the whole Puget Sound region that we had a problem. And the problem was pretty visible, certainly in terms of homelessness, but as well as in housing affordability or lack thereof. But what wasn't clear, at least as I observed these meetings and listened to people, was what was causing this crisis. And so I started to talk to folks that I was getting to know in the city and said, you know, we kind of know in the research literature about some of these structural drivers of homelessness. But if you were just to talk to people at a party on Saturday night about what causes homelessness, you would hear 15 different explanations, one of which might be grounded in empirical research, and others are based on anecdote or observation. And I understand why people reach those conclusions. And so what I decided to do was to write this book, and really started in about 2019, and then finished this up kind of writing during COVID time. And the purpose of the book was I call it translational. The idea was to kind of translate what we've known for a while in the academic literature about the drivers of homelessness, and for an audience of general readers. And so I don't know that I've shared this with a lot of folks, but I actually had my parents in mind when I wrote this book. My parents are college educated. They're not social scientists. They're not PhDs, but they care about the world. They read the New York Times, and I wanted them to be able to pick up the book and say like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I wanted someone who's walking around Seattle saying, I was just in Chicago. It wasn't like this. What is going on? I wanted that person to be able to pick up the book and understand it. So I didn't write this for other professors, which sometimes, you know, we're guilty of doing that sometimes in the academic space. And so this was intentionally not that. And so ultimately, with some support from folks, and we decided to write the book. I partnered with Clay Aldern, who I know was part of one of your sessions, Jesse, earlier this week. Great journalist. We were a good partnership for this book. Clay at the time was actually working in Pierce County on some homelessness work. And we were introduced by Rogers Weed, who's a former Microsoft exec who was chair of, I think, building changes at the time, and introduced us, and we ended up collaborating on the book. I will say that no one is more surprised that people have actually read the book. I knew my parents would, and I thought that might be the end of it. But in fact, more people have read it, and I've been all over the place talking about this book. I just got in from Minneapolis late last night after speaking there yesterday. Been to Australia, been to multiple places in Europe, heading back to the Netherlands to speak this fall. And then what's been fascinating in the United States is I thought I might be in San Francisco and LA and Seattle talking about homelessness, but I've been to places like Lawrence, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri. I was just in Lake of the Ozarks 2 weeks ago talking about homelessness. And so it's gratifying to a certain extent that people are reading and are interested in the story. But what's really concerning to me is when you look at the housing market dynamics in the middle of the country, what we're seeing is this problem is creeping into the interior, which is why I think this is becoming a topic that's not just a New York, Seattle, San Francisco conversation. It's now a Cedar Rapids, Iowa conversation, Green Bay, Wisconsin conversation. And I will say, as someone who thinks about housing data all the time, I've been blown away when I pull up the housing statistics in the middle of the country. State vacancy rate in Iowa, rental market vacancy rate in Iowa is less than 5%. I would have bet a lot of money and been wrong on predicting that. And so this is why we're starting to see a lot more housing challenges in other places. That is a problem. It has a huge human cost. The one silver lining of that is it creates an opportunity for action because people are now seeing the crisis, and we have to take advantage of these opportunities politically and otherwise to convert the anxiety and the concern over these changes into action. And obviously that's what folks here are doing. I appreciate the focus of NUHSA, HDC, everyone who's working on that. So one of the challenges in thinking about a pretty simple question, which is what causes homelessness, is there's a really complicated answer. I joke with my students, and there's a couple students on the call, they'll probably be able to jump in and respond to this, but what I say to my students is the right answer to most good questions is it depends. And there are a few questions that aren't depends, but most of them are. And what's fun, by the end of the quarter, I'll ask a question, then someone will raise their hand and say it depends, and everyone laughs, and it's kind of good. The same is true for homelessness, right? What causes homelessness? Well, it kind of depends. Are we talking about risk of homelessness for an individual? Are we talking about community levels of homelessness? And so we need to ask more discrete questions. We also have a lot of different ways of knowing about homelessness. And one of the ways we know about homelessness is we ask people who have had that experience, either currently or in the past. What were the experiences that led you to experience homelessness? And many times we conduct these surveys in connection with the point in time count, which most jurisdictions do every January. And when we ask people questions about homelessness, they give us really blunt answers. The first time I did this was in Minneapolis in probably 2012. It's January in Minneapolis, it's cold. I was doing survey questions at a youth and young adult shelter. And the questions I was asking these young people would make you blush. They were intrusive. Have you ever traded sex for a place to sleep? And they all said yes, right? I mean, these are just brutal questions. And I think we're getting better at asking questions so we're not traumatizing people. But the point is that people are very, very blunt. And so the central concern I had when I was conceptualizing this book in my head before I ever wrote one word was, I know that when we ask people about their experiences, we get answers that are inconsistent with what Gregg Colburn's going to be putting on this page. And so I know there might be a woman standing next to me saying, I'm homeless because of domestic violence. My boyfriend beat me up and I ran and now I'm homeless. And we need to honor that experience because that's her experience. That's her truth. That is why she's now experiencing homelessness. And so what we do is to try to honor those explanations. And when we ask people, why are you homeless? They might say, well, I lost my job. I got in a fight with my roommate. I made some poor decisions. I drink too much. I got divorced, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we do in the book is try to honor those explanations while also talking about some of the structural drivers of homelessness that is the focus of the book. And the way that we do that is to draw this distinction between precipitating events and root causes. And we draw a distinction not because one is right and one is wrong. They're both true. They interact to produce the crisis of homelessness, but we need to understand the differences between the two if we're going to think about this structurally and hopefully make a huge impact on levels of homelessness, meaning reducing that both in Puget Sound and around the country. And the way that we ultimately decided to do this is using the metaphor of musical chairs. And it's funny, Clay and I kind of had this is our one disagreement on this, and Clay knows this. I like to brag about this, but we had a disagreement on whether to include this in the book. And he thought it was a little sophomoric, and I said, that's the whole point. And so I used first author privilege and said, we're going to put it in the book. And what's funny is this is the one thing we've heard most from people. When I was in Missouri, someone came up to me and said, I've read your book and we were having a fight about this at Thanksgiving. And I actually used your musical chairs analogy at Thanksgiving dinner with my uncle who was railing on homelessness. And so it's been kind of fun to see how people are using this in their everyday lives. You know how this game works. You've probably heard the metaphor, 10 friends, 10 chairs. The leader starts the music, pulls one chair out, music stops, everyone scrambles for a chair. And in this case, Mike loses, who had a bad ankle. He was on crutches. If we asked what caused Mike's chairlessness or why did you lose the game, Mike, he would say, well, I had a bad ankle, and everyone would nod. If we ask a different question, which is why didn't Mike have a chair? It's because we didn't have 10 chairs. And this simple metaphor is exactly what happens for a lot of people walking around 3rd Avenue in Seattle when we see Joe on the street and there's a needle next to Joe. And we say, of course, Joe's homeless, he's addicted. Of course, Mike didn't have a chair, he had a bad ankle. And what we're missing in that simple analysis is the structural deficit of housing that makes it more likely for people like Joe to experience homelessness in a jurisdiction like Seattle. Okay? And it's not to suggest that ankle injuries or addiction or behavioral health challenges don't deserve care and treatment. Of course they do. Of course they do. And I think it's also fair to say that as a state, as a nation, we have had an insufficient response to the behavioral health crisis in our nation. No doubt about that. That can be true at the same time. Can also be true that we have insufficient affordable housing that's creating the conditions for this crisis to improve. So some people have tried to attack us by saying we're trying to pitting housing against treatment. That's not what we're doing. What we're saying is there is a role for treatment in society. We have not done a very good job of that, and we need to make sure that we have sufficient housing. Because if we don't, we will just be fighting this treatment challenge in perpetuity, right? There are people who experience addiction and are housed, lots of people, right? So addiction alone does not necessarily need to be, and hopefully doesn't need to necessarily result in homelessness. And so I also joke that I developed a much thicker skin over the last 3 years, given the emails and social media attacks that I've received. People get really agitated about this argument. They want, from my perspective, they want this to be a drug problem. How dare you suggest this isn't a drug problem, Greg? And what we're not suggesting that it's not. If you are addicted, if you're mentally ill, if you're experiencing poverty, you're more likely to experience homelessness. But we also know that people have those conditions and experiences and attributes in every jurisdiction in the United States. And not all jurisdictions have the same experience with homelessness. So we want to understand that a little more deeply. So the question we pose in the book is a pretty simple one, which is why do rates of homelessness vary so widely throughout the United States? Why does our city, Seattle, have 5 times the homelessness of Chicago? That's massive variation when we think about, a condition, a phenomenon in the social world. 5 times is a lot. We should really want to understand that. And the reason we ask that question is if we can provide a credible answer to it, it should allow us as civic leaders, as policymakers, as concerned citizens to say, hey, how about we focus some time, attention, and resources on that explanation? Because that seems to be really important, okay? And a logical explanation for regional variation is if addiction, mental illness, or poverty cause homelessness at the individual level, which is true, if we have more people with those conditions, we'll have more homelessness. That would be a reasonable, plausible, logical explanation for regional variation. And it turns out not to be true. But it hasn't stopped a lot of people in positions of authority in the United States of making that argument over and over and over again. So this is a book about cities, not about people. And early on, I made this decision that I wanted to center cities in this, not because people don't deserve dignity and care and respect, they do. Too often, though, we end up focusing on individuals experiencing homelessness and blaming them. And I find that to be counterproductive. So instead, what we want to do is say, what the heck is going on in Seattle? Why is the problem so bad here? And therefore, if we can figure that out, then we can hopefully make a meaningful difference as a society and help a lot of people along the way. And the thesis of our book is that tight housing markets accentuate individual vulnerabilities. And these individual factors that receive a lot of attention in the Seattle Times and at cocktail parties when you're talking about homelessness are really a sorting mechanism. They help to identify the people who are most likely to experience homelessness when housing is scarce. Okay. Again, not to suggest we don't have an obligation, a moral or ethical obligation to provide treatment, we do, but that's helping identify who ends up losing this vicious game of musical chairs. Right? The Amazon folks in Seattle are going to win that game every time. They have resources, privilege, advantages that others don't. I have a lot of friends who work at Amazon. I don't know one of them who's experiencing homelessness, right? They're doing just fine, even in a very scarce housing market. So if we're going to center the book around variation in rates of homelessness, we want to demonstrate for you that, in fact, there is big variation. The sample in our book is roughly the 30 largest metro areas in the United States. And so what you'll see here, and this is based on the 2019 data, and that's the last year of data in our book, and I'm going to update some of that for you in this presentation so you just have a sense of where things have gone since then. But one of the bureaucratic nuances, and for those of you who do this work, you know this, so you can check out for a moment, but some places count homelessness at the city level and some count at the county level. King County counts at the county level. Neither way is right or wrong. It's just a different way of doing it. And one of the challenges is that when you're comparing per capita rates of homelessness, you can't really compare counties to cities because counties are including suburban locations where the density of homelessness tends to be less. Homelessness tends to congregate in the urban core. And so what we're careful to do in the book is to compare cities to cities and then separately compare counties to counties to make sure that we have an apples to apples comparison across the board. And when you do that, what you'll see is New York, DC, San Francisco, and Boston have about 5 times the per capita homelessness of Indianapolis and Chicago. Okay. And when we move to counties, the numbers are lower because of this suburban phenomenon and the larger footprint of counties. But what's fascinating, and I didn't realize this until I ran these numbers, was the relationship is still 5 to 1. LA County, Santa Clara County, King County, and Multnomah, which as you know is Portland, are about 5 times Hillsborough, which is Tampa. And so that variation is our object of inquiry in the book. That's what we're going to try to explain. And what we do is take all the reasonable, credible explanations for homelessness and test using pretty simple statistics. Does this help us understand regional variation? And if it doesn't, we cross it off and we move to the next one. There are more complex models behind this for those of you who are statistically inclined, but we didn't build our book around regression analyses because no one understands what a coefficient is. And so we allude to all these studies in the book, but thought that that was not going to be a productive way to change people's minds. And even for some folks, just the simple graphs that you'll see are a little bit much, but we'll walk through them. This is the more updated version of this slide, and what you'll see is basically the story is the same. It's gotten worse in a couple places, but basically we still have huge variation throughout the United States. For those of you who are following data, things have gotten complicated in COVID, and so it's one of the challenges of updating these data is both the census data and the point in time counts were very disrupted during the COVID timeframe. But generally speaking, the story is similar, that we've got a few jurisdictions with huge homelessness and others that don't. We see kind of growing challenges in places like Denver, Atlanta, and some other places, Sacramento, really big increases in the last 5 years. All right, so in the next 15 or 20 minutes, I'm going to run through these explanations, and then I'll turn it over to you for Q&A and comments, grievances, whatever you want to share. And so there are more in the book than this, but you don't want to go through all of them, but this will give you enough of a flavor of the argument. So we're going to start with poverty. Why? Because poverty is fundamental to homelessness, right? We, of course, could have written a book that said homelessness is a poverty problem. If you have limited financial resources, you're far more likely to experience homelessness. But what's interesting is when you plot rates of homelessness against rates of poverty at a community level, and just to orient you on what you're looking at, the bottom axis or the x-axis here is the poverty rate in a community. So you'll see on the right 40%. That would suggest that 40% of the people in that jurisdiction are below the federal poverty line, super high poverty. And then the y-axis, the vertical axis, is rates of homelessness. So the higher that number, the more per capita homelessness. And what you'll see here is a modest statistical relationship between poverty and homelessness, but it's in the opposite direction of what we would expect. Right? Places with really high rates of poverty, think Cleveland or Detroit, have far lower rates of homelessness than really rich cities like Seattle and San Francisco. And this is a head scratcher because I just told you that poverty causes homelessness. We all know that poverty causes homelessness, but at the community level, homelessness thrives amidst affluence. This does not mean that poverty doesn't matter. I am all for anti-poverty measures. What this means is that being poverty in a really affluent place has huge, huge consequences. Being poor in Detroit is no picnic, and I'm not ever going to suggest that it is, but if you need to get to $700 a month in terms of rent, you might be able to get there. Trying to get to $2,000 a month in Seattle or San Francisco or Boston is incredibly difficult, which is one of the reasons we argue that homelessness is far more prevalent in affluent places with really expensive housing markets. We're now entering the portion of the talk where people's blood pressure starts to rise. And so you can just take a deep breath if you feel your anxiety building, but we're going to talk about mental illness and substance use disorders. Okay. This data comes from the federal government, and hopefully this data will continue to be gathered. There's some threat to that currently. It comes from SAMHSA, which is a federal division of Health and Human Services at the federal level. The data on drug use and mental illness is actually better at the state level. And so for a moment, we convert from city analysis or county analysis to state level analysis, but it's the same logic. This is looking at rates of serious mental illness in every state in the nation over 13 years relative to rates of homelessness. And what you'll see is there's essentially no relationship. There are people experiencing serious mental illness in every jurisdiction in the United States. The problem in Washington, California, and Oregon is not that we have disproportionate numbers of people who are mentally ill. Do we have people experiencing mental illness? Of course we do. Of course we do. The consequences of those conditions are probably worse here than others because finding housing is certainly more challenging. So we can't blame it on just more mentally ill folks. The same is true with substance use disorders. For those of you who study statistics, R squared of 0.06 is basically nothing. There are people using and abusing drugs in every jurisdiction in the United States. This really irritates people. And when people get upset with me, I'll just say, well, let's talk about Chicago. Do you think people use drugs in Chicago? And the answer to that question is yes, they do. And when we think about overdose death rates, states with the highest overdose death rates, West Virginia, Tennessee, Mississippi, places where the opioid epidemic has ravaged those states, they have some of the lowest rates of homelessness in the United States. If you fundamentally believe that this crisis is driven by drugs, we should see a massive per capita rate of homelessness in West Virginia, but we don't. It's not to minimize those tragedies. It's had huge consequences for those states and for the people who live there. But homelessness is not one of the consequences. So of course, addiction and our response to addiction and substance use disorders is necessary, and we need to think about how to treat that properly, but that cannot be our sole focus. It's also really important to know that there are a whole bunch of people experiencing homelessness who are not mentally ill and not using drugs. And there are a lot of people who work every day living in their cars who can't afford to live. And so we end up focusing our time and attention on behavioral health challenges, justifiably so, because this is what we might see on the street on 3rd Avenue. And what we're missing is all the people, kind of the iceberg that's under the water that's hidden. It's moms and kids living in shelter. It's people who are working, living in their cars and showering at the YMCA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The other point that's super important when we talk about behavioral health challenges is the causal arrow goes in both directions. Being addicted or having a mental illness may cause us to experience homelessness, no doubt about that. But we also know that the trauma associated with homelessness is a causal driver of behavioral health challenges. When we leave people on the streets without shelter, being victimized physically and sexually, not eating, not sleeping, and not getting medical care, we're then surprised that they develop behavioral health challenges. It should not surprise us at all. It's a natural human response to brutal trauma. And so what I say to people is, if you want less visible drug use and mental illness on our streets, how about we get people housed? If we don't, we are pouring gasoline on the fire of our behavioral health challenges. Okay. Finally, race. We have to talk about race when we're talking about homelessness because people of color, Black, brown, Indigenous folks are grossly overrepresented in the homeless population, 3 to 5 times overrepresented, depending on the race or ethnicity that you're thinking about. And so one question then becomes is, does race help us understand this regional variation question? And the short answer to that question is no, it doesn't. Okay, so how do we make sense of this kind of negative relationship between race and homelessness when we know that there's huge racial disparity? The way that I describe this is that race doesn't cause homelessness. Being Black doesn't cause homelessness. This is the share of people who identify as Black or African American in cities and counties, and what you'll see is there's no positive relationship. If being Black caused homelessness, Chicago on a per capita basis would have way more homelessness than Chicago, so they have a much higher Black population than Seattle does. Seattle's a disproportionately white city. Okay. What does cause homelessness is racism. And that's what explains huge disparities. Racism explains why people of color are overrepresented in the homeless population in Seattle and Chicago and Jackson, Mississippi and Boston and basically every jurisdiction in the United States. So racism in multiple sectors and institutions, criminal justice, education, healthcare, housing, employment, you name it, for hundreds of years helps to explain this huge disparity that exists in almost every jurisdiction in the United States. So it helps to identify who is going to experience homelessness in a city. It doesn't explain why Seattle has so much more homelessness than Chicago, if that makes sense. So none of these kind of individual attributes or characteristics has helped us answer this question anyway. So we're still hunting for a better explanation. Okay. This section of the book was included because of conversations I had usually at social gatherings with people lecturing me about the causes of homelessness. And I wanted to respond to this, okay? And you may have been at gatherings where you've heard similar things. Greg, LA's warm, Chicago's cold. Of course, LA's gonna have more homelessness. I've always struggled with the weather argument when people make it and apply it to Seattle, because having grown up in Minnesota, I'm used to cold weather. And I will say 39 and rain in Seattle in January is probably the most uncomfortable weather I've ever been in. And the thought of someone then saying like, yeah, this is a great place to live unhoused is, one, insulting, and two, just not consistent with just the human experience of weather, in my opinion. But it doesn't stop people from talking about the weather in the West Coast all the time. So when we plot weather in January, which is when we count homelessness in the United States, what we'll see is there might be some nonlinear relationship for those of you who are really nerdy here, but generally speaking, there's not much of a relationship. There are warm jurisdictions with low rates of homelessness, cities in Florida and Texas and Arizona, and there are cold places like Boston, New York that have lots and lots of homelessness. Okay? So it's tempting to blame Mother Nature. We love to blame an outside force because then we don't have to accept responsibility ourselves, but in this case, we can't do that. For those of you who are really wonky, there is a relationship between unsheltered homelessness and weather, because West Coast jurisdictions have not constructed robust shelters. So visible unsheltered homelessness is more prevalent in LA and San Diego and San Francisco than it is in Boston and New York, where they shelter most of their folks. And we talk about that in more detail in the book. But overall homelessness, which is people in shelter and people who are living in unsheltered places, there's no relationship to weather. If we stop being so generous, people would stop moving here to experience homelessness. Right? There's a variant of the mobility or magnet argument almost everywhere I go. Everyone thinks they're a magnet. That's not how magnets work. This is TANF, which is the primary federal welfare program, typically for women and children. Huge state-to-state variation. We have stingy states and generous states. And let's just be really clear. When I say generous states, what I mean is more generous than the stingy states. If you've ever studied social policy, you'll see that the benefits provided through federal welfare programs are pretty limited. Okay, we can actually see, are families experiencing homelessness congregating in generous states? Meaning, are they moving to jurisdictions where they can get more money? And the answer to that question is no. This doesn't mean that generous benefits aren't helpful. I support them politically and otherwise. I think it's a really good idea, but people are not making locational decisions to move 2,000 miles away for an extra $100 a month or $150 a month, right? It just doesn't make logical sense. We also know that low-income mobility, state-to-state mobility, is very low because moving is hard, is expensive, and it's disruptive. So when people say to me, Greg, why don't people just leave Seattle? I'll say, this is their home, right? They've got relatives who take care of their kids when they go to work, and now you're saying they should move to Kansas because it's cheaper? Doesn't seem right to me. We've priced people out of this community, and then we're saying, why don't they just leave? The counter argument is, these are all people from other parts of the country that are coming here to take advantage of our benefits. And what we see is there's almost no evidence of that. Is there anecdotal evidence of it? Probably. I'm sure someone moved from Indianapolis to LA, and then someone interviewed him and said, oh, there's all these people coming from Indiana. Margot Kuchel, my friend and colleague at UCSF, published this great study of homelessness in California. They found that 90% of the people who are experiencing homelessness in California are from California. So we can spend a lot of time wringing our hands and worrying about the 5 or 10% of people where there might be a mobility story, or we can just kind of acknowledge that we as states and cities and counties have created the conditions over decades that have produced this crisis. And therefore we need to look in the mirror and deal with that ourselves, as opposed to worrying about some phantom migrant from another state or country, which ends up getting disproportionate time and attention when we talk about homelessness. Politics, you know, you may have been following politics recently. It's quite contentious, especially around homelessness. During Trump's first term, he and Gavin Newsom, governor of California, got in a big fight about this. Trump was blaming Democrats on the West Coast for homelessness. It is true that West Coast cities have lots of homelessness and they're run by Democrats. What Trump was missing in all that is that Democrats also run Cleveland and Chicago and St. Louis and Philadelphia and other places without lots of homelessness. Newsom's argument was that it was the federal government's fault because they had pulled away from low-income housing policy, which is a true statement. But that alone doesn't explain regional variation, because that would presumably, we should have equal challenges if it's just federal retrenchment. Why would we have such a huge variation from jurisdiction to jurisdiction if it's just federal money moving away? So the point is that there's more going on here. And also the final point here is, this is not to isolate or to absolve Democrats of all responsibility. I think that's really important, that it is true that Democrats have been in charge in Washington, Oregon, and California for a long time. And they have been in charge as we've gone through a massive, massive housing crisis. And so therefore, I think there is some looking in the mirror, not only for Republicans, but also for Democrats, to say, what did we do here that allowed this crisis to flourish? Because it did happen on the Democrats' watch. And so the point here is that there's finger pointing all around here. So the final explanation, which is probably not a terrible surprise to any of you, given the title of our book, is that the housing market really matters when we think about rates of homelessness. Okay, this is median contract rents and rates of homelessness, and what you'll see is, statistically speaking, a far more compelling explanation than anything else we test in the book. Related variables, vacancy rates. When vacancy rates get below, this is rental vacancy. When rental vacancy gets below 5%, urban economists would suggest that we have a deficit of rental housing. It's like unemployment, you never get to 0% because someone leaves their chair and then it's open for a little bit. Same thing with housing. We never get to 0. Below 5% would suggest that we don't have enough housing. What you'll see is in the United States, when vacancy rates get low, homelessness tends to increase. And when you combine those two, there is not a counterexample. Every place in the United States with high rents and low vacancies has a problem with homelessness. And so is homelessness complex? Of course it is. Is this a perfect predictor? I would never suggest it is, but it's a lot better predictor than most of the other stuff that people are talking about when they get irritated about homelessness at a cocktail party. Okay. So I would argue, and I think Clay would argue, that this deserves some focus and attention nationally, at the state level, county level, city level, that if we want more stability, housing stability, is we need more housing and it needs to be more affordable. So why do we have this problem in Seattle? Is it because of Amazon? Is it because of people moving here? The answer to that question is not solely. This surprised me. When you look at population growth and rates of homelessness, you don't see much of a relationship. And what I realized in that simple analysis is we're only looking at demand for housing here. We're not looking at the supply of housing. And that's where we got to put both of them together. So we spend some time in the book talking about supply elasticity, and I might call on some former students here to maybe give this part of the lecture, but in the interest of time, I will do it quickly. But supply elasticity is important, which is how much housing is built when the price of housing changes. Some places build a lot of housing when prices go up, some places don't. The two drivers of supply elasticity are regulations and topography. If you have mountains and water and you have a really strict regulatory environment, you're not going to build much housing. Think San Francisco, California. It's the hardest place in the United States to build housing. One, they have mountains and water, which make it a beautiful place, and they have a really, really strict regulatory environment, which makes it hard to build housing. When you layer a tech boom and a population boom on top of an inelastic housing market, what do? You get a disaster. You get a social and human disaster in terms of housing unaffordability and homelessness. And so while tragic, it was totally predictable. And the frustrating thing about our community is we watched San Francisco go through this, and the same thing happened to us, which is we layered a tech boom on top of an inelastic housing market, and we ended up with really low vacancies, high rents, and an associated problem with homelessness. Now, we are not as inelastic as San Francisco. We frankly built a lot more housing than they have on a per capita basis. And so kudos to everyone in this community who have built that housing and supported that housing, but it still hasn't been enough. We are still not where we need to be, and that's why we have the challenges that we have. This is a pretty interesting visual of kind of thinking about supply and demand of housing. The bottom axis, change in population, think of that as a proxy for housing demand. High growth, high demand for housing. And then supply elasticity is on the y-axis. And so the bigger numbers would suggest that you build more housing. And so it's interesting, over the decade of the 2010s, the Sun Belt cities of Dallas, San Antonio, Charlotte, et cetera, grew just as fast as Seattle, Boston, and San Francisco. But what did they do? They built a ton of housing, and they were able to maintain more reasonable rental market vacancies. That's the number in parentheses. Now, a lot of that growth in housing was probably through sprawl, and it's probably not the type of housing that we would advocate for in our community. One, because it's hard for us to sprawl, and two, it's not terribly environmentally friendly. I would advocate for up rather than out. But the point is that when you build the units, you can accommodate growth. That's the lesson from the Sun Belt. Not that we should necessarily replicate all their policies. What we should learn from them is when you build the units, you can accommodate growth far better than we did. The bottom right-hand quadrant is the perfect storm for the crisis that we're talking about here. Tragic, but totally predictable. So what's happened since? We have the pandemic. It's disrupted a lot of things. The only good news in all of this is that the logic of the book holds, and that's selfishly speaking, right? You don't want to write a book and then have everything like thrown out. The logic of the book is continuing to hold, but it's holding in more places, which is bad for human beings and bad for society. Phoenix, Austin, Sacramento, Atlanta, Denver are exhibiting housing market characteristics that look a lot like our coastal cities. And what we're seeing there is we're seeing homelessness really increasing. And then our coastal problem children remain problem children. So how do we respond? This is hard. It takes a long time. Building housing takes a long time. I need to get reelected tomorrow, Gregg. So what have we been wrestling with? We've been wrestling with the criminalization of homelessness. So let's keep people off the streets. I'm tired of this person urinating outside my restaurant. Get them out of here, right? We hear this all the time from business groups. And I understand that. I want to acknowledge, like, I understand why having someone sleeping outside of your restaurant, your place of business is a problem. I think we can acknowledge that without necessarily going to the path of, therefore, our response is to round them up and criminalize this. The Supreme Court, US Supreme Court, last year in the Grants Pass case gave a green light to the criminalization of homelessness, of sleeping on public land. Okay, lots of states are now pursuing criminalization bills. I have a Google alert for the name of our book. And so I get an alert every time it's used, and it's fascinating to see how it's being used around the United States. This is from Oklahoma. There is a legislator in Oklahoma who is proposing a criminalization bill on state land in the state of Oklahoma. This journalist, who I don't know, must have read our book, and she asked this fellow, Representative Weaver, does he think homelessness is a housing problem? And his response was, it could be. I mean, it could be if they don't have any place to live. Right? This is both humorous and tragic as a quote, right? And this is someone who's proposing criminalization, but when pushed has to acknowledge, like, yeah, there's a housing part of the story here. So to wrap up here, how do we think about some of these challenges? I have heard more times than you can imagine, Gregg, we've spent X hundred millions of dollars, billions of dollars on homelessness. The problem has gotten worse. Why should we continue to make these investments? And I think we should all be concerned about good use of public resources. We want our policymakers to be good stewards of these funds. And so I think it's a fair question. I don't criticize people for asking that question. My response to them is I take issue with the implication for two reasons. One is the scale of our response has typically been insufficient to the scale of the crisis. Even in LA with $1.3 billion for HHH, it's woefully insufficient to a problem that's probably $50 billion in scale, right? We can't blame $1 billion intervention being ineffective when you're trying to fight a $50 billion problem. The other point that I make is that a lot of the money we spend on homelessness is in response to the crisis. And I'm grateful for all the people on this call who did this work. We have created crisis response systems. We created shelters, which are life-saving interventions. And then we blame those systems for ongoing homelessness, which is absurd. Those systems exist to care for people when they need help. People continue to flow into homelessness, not because of the failure of shelter or a crisis response system. It's because we don't have sufficient housing upstream to maintain people who help them maintain stable housing. That's the story. I joke that it's like blaming the emergency room for people continuing to break their arms. You break your arm, you show up at the ER, they put a cast on, they send you home, and the next day someone else breaks their arm. We don't blame the ER doc for it. People are still breaking their arms. It's not their fault. They're there to care for us. So I get really upset when we go after the crisis response system for ineffectiveness when in fact they're doing really, really important and life-saving work. What we've not done is intervened upstream and created sufficient housing, and specifically affordable housing, to reduce the flow of folks into that crisis response system. Our crisis response systems, while flawed and challenging because this is complex, are actually pretty darn good. Even LA, which gets a lot of flack, gets an incredible number of people housed out of the crisis response system. But while they're doing that, more people are flowing in. And so their overall homeless count goes up because the inflow is greater than the outflow. And then the LA Times writes a story saying that this is a massive failure, which is really tough for people who are doing this work every day to kind of stomach, because we just got 20,000 people housed over the last couple of years. That's pretty good, but 30,000 people entered homelessness. And so the number went up, right? So we need to think about this holistically and as a system. And then when we start to talk about more housing upstream, that's when we get into local political challenges. And obviously HDC is deeply involved in this. We think about land use and permitting and NIMBYism and all these other things, and what subsidy is needed to make sure that housing is affordable. And those are hard conversations, right? It's easy for me to talk about. It's really hard to implement, which is why we continue to have these debates in the city of Seattle, King County, in Olympia every year. And we need to continue to have them and kind of fight through them because these are absolutely necessary. All right, I'll wrap up here. My hope with this was that that we would take a little bit of focus off of Joe on the street. And that's a slightly dangerous thing to say because I think we ultimately need to really focus on Joe and care for Joe and be compassionate. But my fear was that when we center Joe in these conversations, it allows too many people to walk by and say, you know, I feel bad for Joe, but he made some poor decisions. My focus with this book was to hopefully force people to look in the mirror at night when they're brushing their teeth and say, I, Gregg Colburn, have contributed to this structure over my lifetime. And therefore I'm implicated, and all of us in this community are implicated in this crisis. And therefore we then need to work on structural changes, which require political courage and resources and things that are at times in short supply. And therefore, what are we collectively going to do to make sure that we have sufficient housing such that far fewer Joes end up on the street? And the final point people say to me is, I'm not convinced this is going to work, Gregg. These people are in a really tough spot. I don't think it's going to work. And I'll say, well, the reason I'm confident it does work is because we literally just did it. As a nation, we cut veteran homelessness by 55% in 10 years. And why do we do it? Because it's good politics. Let's be really clear about that. Republicans and Democrats said we don't want men and women returning from Iraq and Afghanistan to experience homelessness like the Vietnam generation. And I'm grateful they did that. I am all for housing veterans. And what I love about this is that it shows is that when you make a concerted, scaled investment through the VA and HUD, we can cut homelessness. For some people, it's just a voucher. That's all they need and they're off to the races. Other people have severe behavioral health challenges and we give them services and housing and we're off to the races. So the point here is that we know what works. The reason we're continuing to fight this challenge is that we've drawn the line right now at veterans. If we were to draw the line elsewhere, we could have sustained success with other populations as well. We've chosen not to. That's why we're fighting this problem. It's a decision that we collectively have made as a nation and as a state and as local jurisdictions. So thanks so much for your attention and focus on this. I really appreciate you joining the call today. Thanks to NUHSA for inviting me. Thanks to HDC for hosting Affordable Housing Week. And I look forward to any comments or questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Greg. That was fantastic. I am going to open up the chat. I've seen a couple questions start filtering in. If someone would like to raise their hand, I have the power to unmute you. Also, please, if you've been sitting on a question, feel free. This is the time to type it in.
Looks like Hallie Willis has her hand up.
Excellent.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Gregg. I think you've done something really special with this book and being able to communicate with like regular people about this issue. My question is about deregulation, because you mentioned that like having a really strict regulatory environment can, like, of course, make it harder to develop affordable housing. I always get a little queasy when when people are like, let's deregulate the market and that's going to solve our affordable housing problem. Because we, of course, have a lot of regulations that are good, and we can't reasonably expect free market capitalism to serve people that are like extremely poor. So can you just talk a little bit more about that? Like, what specifically are you looking at?
Absolutely. Great question. And I end up changing up what I say each time, because partly just for my own interest, I can't say the same thing over. So sometimes when I'm giving my talk, I pause on that point and say, let's talk about regulation for a moment, which is there's an important role for regulation in society. And I joke that I want my ground beef to be safe, right? So there are health and safety regulations that make sense. There are health and safety regulations around housing. I don't want people to live in housing that's going to collapse on them. So of course, there's a role for regulation in society. So I am not in the camp of just get rid of every regulation, all our problems go away. I am in the camp of saying that right now it's taking 7 years to build housing in San Francisco and people are dying on the streets. That to me seems unacceptable. And there has to be a middle ground between reasonable regulation and getting housing built in a city that needs it more than any other place in the United States. And so I think there's a huge national conversation going on about this right now. And we can talk about the land use and these other challenges. No doubt about that. In addition to that, and one of the other things I'll also talk about in some of my talks is I get accused of being a shill for corporate interests, because I say that we should make it easier to build housing for private developers, and people accuse me of that. And then other people accuse me of being a socialist, because out of my next sentence is that there are going to be people who can't afford that housing, and there's nothing wrong with socialism, but that's not socialism, that's mathematics, right? And so we need to have an adult conversation about how are we then going to ensure that people can afford housing, and that's where the subsidy conversation comes in. So as a policymaker, there are regulatory levers that don't cost you anything financially. They may cost you politically. And then there are dollars, actual financial dollars, where we need to think about subsidy, which is subsidizing developers. It's subsidizing households through rental assistance. There's other packages in terms of supports for tenants that are all part of this conversation. And so in all of this, I always say it's all the above, that it's a blend of all these initiatives. deregulating or changing land use alone will not fix this, but they're important inputs into a comprehensive response, in my opinion.
Thank you. Let's go to Robin. Oh, let's.
Here I am.
Thank
I'm
you.
here. Thank you, Greg. This has just been fascinating, and I am just writing an essay on housing right now, so it's been very helpful. I'm a planning consultant, have been working with communities in primarily King County on updating comprehensive plans and development regulations. And as you know, you must know that we now have laws that override single-family zoning to permit more dwelling units in single-family neighborhoods. And it seems like a great idea. The legislature thinks that the inclusion of so-called middle housing is going to make a dent in our housing supply. But I've been told by people in the industry, realtor, economists, bankers, that it's going to take decades for people to actually become accustomed to having their house turned into 1 or 2 units, a house built in the backyard. In my neighborhood, I can also put a little corner shop out on the, because I live on a corner. And this time lapse is just going to prevent getting people in houses quicker than, I mean, as soon as we need them to get in housing. This time lapse is concerning me. Does it concern you?
Yes. So one of the tension, we highlight 3 tensions in the book. I didn't talk about this in the presentation that complicate this. And one of the tensions is short versus long term, that there is an immediate need and a comprehensive change to our housing approach in the United States is long-term in nature. And so if you're Mayor Harrell thinking about how am I going to get reelected next year, Mayor Harrell can't stand up and say, my goal is to build, 200,000 housing units over the next 20 years, which will alleviate pressures in the housing market and reduce homelessness. And people say, well, what are you going to do tomorrow? Right. And so I share your concern with that, which is that a housing alone response to homelessness is not sufficient. We need to also think about the short term, which is why I'm really concerned about what's going on in the judiciary right now in terms of criminalization. And so, in Seattle, we probably need to be having a conversation about additional shelter capacity, other short-term mechanisms that we can create quickly to alleviate the suffering of homelessness while we're still doing the work we need to do to create more housing over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Because that need, that I think it's 800,000 units per Puget Sound Regional Council in our region, that's not going away. And it's getting worse every year that we underproduce. And so we can do 2 things at one time. We're smart, innovative people, but focusing solely on the long term does expose politicians in our community to these short-term challenges. So you're absolutely right. But the problem is if you only focus on the short term, and we replicate New York City, which is to just create a massive shelter system, they now are 25 years in to a massive shelter system that consumes $2 billion a year. And they basically warehouse people in the shelter system for years at a time, and there's no place for them to go. And so when people say, well, let's focus on the short term and build more shelter here, I'll say, yes, but I am not an advocate for New York 2.0. I don't think that's a path that I wish for our community. Others may disagree, and that's fine, but we have to keep our eye on both the short and long-term ball, which is hard, to your point, right? If this were easy, we would have done it. I think there are other things that we can do. Minneapolis, my hometown, has shown they relaxed land use. They got rid of single family zoning throughout the entire city, and then they did a whole bunch of stuff around it. And what researchers are finding is changing parking minimums and some of these other things that they changed had a more immediate impact than the land use changes alone. So, and I think there's also then a role for government in terms of incentive of creating the outcome that you want and accelerating some of that. To me, that's a good use of state or county or local dollars to basically say, we need more housing, we need it more quickly, and what can we do to incentivize that, whether it's state money around infrastructure needs, when you're building new housing, et cetera. Anyway, we could talk about this for hours, but I think you're spot on. And so having a holistic, comprehensive view of that is super important.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see if we can squeeze in a question from Jeff and then Stacy.
Sure.
Can we unmute Jeff? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg. One of the, I posted this in the chat, but thinking about reducing regulation and cost of development, there's, those seem like the carrots, making it easier to do it. Is there also a stick option where having some kind of penalty or increased tax toward underdeveloped land or undeveloped land? Is there anything in your research that you've seen where that sort of stick approach also works, or how effective is it for increasing housing elasticity and supply?
Yeah, I think I am not a researcher of the sticks, but I certainly have read it with great interest. And so when push comes to shove, I tend to believe that the carrots are a little bit more effective, but I think there are appropriate sticks that can be used. I think when you think about kind of fair share allocation of housing throughout a community, throughout a region, I think that's one where sticks can and should be used, because we've just seen this over and over and over again, where privileged communities say, well, we shouldn't be subject to these kind of regional housing needs. We're special. And so that to me is where a stick is appropriate to say, no, you're part of this, right? And you need to be contributing to that. And therefore there probably needs to be some teeth behind those requirements, because without the stick, it's really hard to enforce that. So I think a healthy balance of carrots and sticks in policy making is helpful. But the ultimate stick is money, and that should come from higher levels of government, federal and state, not state right now, we don't have the money, but in another world, those carrots are really valuable.
Thank you. And let's finish up with Stacy.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yep.
One of the things that I have been advocating for years, because I've seen an issue, is that our state and federal government has provided incentives. They've provided grants, and the affordable housing phrase was supposed to be for the extremely lower levels so that we can get people housed and keep people housed, being that our city is 60 to 70% cost burden, as well as other cities. But they've been misleading the type of housing and using that phrase, even though dashboards show that we need the 30% AMI and the 50% AMI for rental level and the 50 and 60% for home ownership. We also need higher percentages of projects from developers to be affordable units, and everybody keeps having it at the 70 and 80%. And then on the other side too, when people are trying to go for help, there's so many barriers. And for each section of help, you need to fill out another applications. And sometimes some of those are 12 pages long just to get, $100 in your pocket so that you can buy gas or go to the next spot. So I think we need to centralize all that and have great oversight so that the people that really need the help are getting the help.
Yeah, you highlight some fundamental challenges that any response I have will be inadequate to the challenges that you highlight. In terms of housing policy, because that's where I spend most of my time, I think it's really important to highlight that when we made the transition from public housing to vouchers and tax credits over the last 40 years, which was part of the neoliberal move in policymaking globally, our housing policies were not designed to meet the lowest income folks. And my favorite example of highlighting this was I taught an affordable housing studio at UW a couple of years ago. And there were a lot of students in this class who were very kind of justice oriented, and they wanted to build housing for really low income folks. And that was awesome. And so we were using tax credits, which is the primary production subsidy in the United States. And we were partnering with SHA on this hypothetical project, and we had a parcel and they were building the model. And I remember a student raising her hand and she said, Greg, I have a question. And I walked over and I said, yeah, what's going on? She's like, we're building the model and we're going to have to charge higher rents. And I started to laugh and I said, this is the fundamental problem. And this is such a great learning opportunity, because this is someone who came in and said, I want to build 0 to 30 housing. I said, go for it. And she said, this doesn't work. And I was like, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. And so the problem that we have is the tools, production tools that we have can serve 70 and 80 and they can't serve 30. The math doesn't work. And so Forcing developers to build 0 to 30 when the money isn't there, it's not going to happen. They just won't, the capital won't flow to those. And that's a fair conversation of, should we structure society differently? Probably so. But our housing policy has got to change. We can't just put our heads in the sand and say, why isn't 0 to 30 housing getting built? It's not going to get built unless we change the subsidy. The subsidies have to exist to support that. And just complaining about the LIHTC program or whatever is not going to get us there, which is why we fundamentally have to rethink housing policy, which is why I would have loved if the expansion of the voucher program would have happened in Build Back Better. There are critiques of vouchers, but ultimately having purchasing power in people's hands makes development easier. It makes LIHTC a lot easier because then you're getting basically market rents in those units when people have a voucher. And so, yeah, we have massive shortcomings in our federal housing policy, which has created huge challenges for the state of Washington, for King County and the city of Seattle. And that's why this is a really hard job to be working in those jurisdictions. And so I agree with your concerns 100%. And what we need to acknowledge is that the math has to work for this housing to get built. And that's frustrating. You know, in Netherlands, 30% of housing is publicly owned. In the United States, is about 2%. When you add vouchers in, it's 5%. And so when people call me a socialist, they'll say we could triple our public involvement in housing in the United States and we'd still be half of the Netherlands. It's really hard to get people housed in market rate housing. And it's not because developers are easy. It's just because the math doesn't work. And so, yes, we need to have a much broader conversation that goes beyond the borders of Puget Sound. But we're at time now. So again, I leave you with insufficient evidence and resources to fix this problem, but we know what we need to do, and we need to advocate, we need to vote, and we need to build a lot more housing. And I appreciate everyone on this call who's doing that work.
Well, thank you so much, Greg. Thank you for giving us the motivation and the tools and the discussion. I think we're all disappointed that we didn't quite get a chance to completely solve the housing crisis today on the 60-minute call, but I think we're all feeling some hope and motivation that maybe our little corner has some new data and information that maybe we can keep doing our bit. Jesse, can you resend in the chat the calendar of events? If you love today's event, there's more great information of events. This is Affordable Housing Month, Affordable Housing Week. There's great events just like this happening in cities throughout King County. So there's a series of videos in Redmond, there's open houses, there's letter writing campaigns. There are so many amazing things happening. Thank you. Here's the calendar of events. So we are going to close with this. Whatever part of the community there you are a part of, there is something for you. So thank you for tuning in to this NUHSA sponsored talk for affordable housing. Thank you for listening to Greg. Thank you for joining with your neighbors, learning about housing. So go on, take care of yourselves, go take care of your neighbor, and have a great week, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Just saving the chat, and now I'm going to end the meeting.
Okay. Take care.
Okay.
Wonderful job, Sarah. Just
Thank
amazing.
you, ladies.
Thank
Yeah.
you.